It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Louise McBee Lecture, given annually by a distinguished scholar and leader in higher education. This series was launched in 1989, 1 year after Dr. McBee retired from UGA. This event holds the distinction of being one of the nation's longest standing lecture series focused solely on higher education. Today, we honor and remember Dr. Louise McBee. She was one of Georgia's best known and most admired leaders. In March of this year, she passed away quietly at the age of 96. Her long life was marked by significant achievements and accolades. Dr. McBee was a native of rural Strawberry Plains, Tennessee, where she was valedictorian of her graduating class. Education was her stepping stone and life's work. She completed a PhD in psychology and counseling from the Ohio State University in 1961 and joined the University of Georgia in 1963 as Dean of Women. At this time, no one recognized that Dr. McBee would become an icon over the next 5 decades. At UGA, Dr. McBee saw the beginning of integration, the end of in loco parentis, and the need for faculty to be supported in governance and instruction. She championed equity for women, faculty, and underserved students. After 25 years of exemplary leadership, she retired from UGA in 1988. But one outstanding career was not enough for the indomitable Louise McBee. In 1991, she ran and was elected to the Georgia House of Representatives. Afterwards, she served 5 unopposed terms, retiring in 2004. Now, who would run against Louise McBee? She was a trailblazer as an administrator and legislator. Across her career, she was widely regarded as one of the most influential women in Georgia politics and education. Her legacy continues today. In her will, Dr. McBee's lifelong commitment to the University of Georgia and higher education was demonstrated by a transformative gift to the Institute of Higher Education, her academic home. In recognition of her exemplary leadership and endless generosity, earlier this morning we cut the ribbon and named the Institute of Higher Education for Dr. Louise McBee. Please join me now in viewing a short video that we produced in 2013 for the 25th anniversary of the lecture. The comments and accolades are timeless.
Welcome to the 25th Annual Louise McBee Lecture at the University of Georgia. Louise McBee has been a true pioneer in advancing issues in higher education forward. And year after year, this lecture series not only celebrates what she has done for the University of Georgia, but it also brings individuals together to talk about the future of higher education.
When Louise came to UGA in 1963, it was not common for women to be in senior leadership positions, but over the next 25 years, she really rose through the ranks. She was Dean of Women, she was Associate Dean of Students, and then Dean of Students. She served as the Assistant Vice President for Instruction. She served as the Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs, and then she was the Senior Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs. Dr. McBee and Dean William Tate were largely credited for helping UGA avoid the violence that was present on many other campuses during the 60s and 70s.
Every relationship between the university and student was tested in that period between the 60s and the 70s. In my opinion, there will be no 2 decades in at least to this point in higher education that have been where there have been more changes between the relationship of the institution to the student.
She had a very good sense of academic values about what was right and what was wrong, what we needed to do, but she also had enormous credibility inside the university community.
I'm very honored to be the holder of a professorship where it's named for such an outstanding woman as Louise McBee. Louise would want us to keep going forward and trying to change things so that there is a continued expanded role for women in higher education. And the first thing she would say is, well, they only get 92 cents on the dollar, and I would want them to get the whole dollar.
Louise always said education is job one. She said that education is to the state of Georgia as defense is to the federal government. So she thought that and believed and always advocated that the success of Georgia was dependent upon the success of its flagship institution and the other institutions across the system.
And when she retired, one of my dear recollections is the red and black headline that said, "Beloved Vice President retires." Now, I would challenge anybody to find in a student newspaper anywhere in the country where a vice president is called beloved.
The traits that made her successful as a university administrator, being a good listener, being collegial, being respectful of other people, being really smart about the issues, are exactly the traits that would be transferable to the political world.
In the General Assembly, she was looked upon with great respect and great deference, to be quite frank with you. It doesn't surprise me at all that she ran 5 times unopposed. Who would run against Louise McBee and have any hope of being elected?
The teachers in this state had never had credit for unused sick leave, which means a day a month for all the time you work. And so I that was one of the first things I began to work on. It was very expensive to do, but I finally got it done. But that was one of the bills that I was the proudest of.
Well, you just can't tell Louise no. And I told her, I said, you get it passed, I'll sign it. When Louise McBee spoke, everybody listened.
You knew that you were in the presence of someone great when you spent time with Louise McBee. She took time to combine the personal with the professional, and so I think that's one reason that Louise has meant so much to so many of us all through the years. She took a very holistic approach to her mentoring and to her caring, and I want to personally say thank you to her for all that she has done for me and other women at UGA and across the state. We are profoundly grateful and honored to be named the Louise McBee Institute of Higher Education. Her legacy will live on in the achievements of our students and our graduates. And now it is my pleasure to call upon my colleague and friend, President Jerry W. Moorhead, the 22nd President of the University of Georgia, to introduce today's distinguished lecturer.
Good morning, everyone. It is such a great day to be celebrating Louise McBee. And it's my privilege to be here on this very special occasion as we celebrate the naming of the Institute to introduce as the speaker today someone that has such a wonderful and storied history with the University of Georgia, President Joan T.A. Gabel from the University of Minnesota. She has much in common with the late Dr. McBee. Both grew up in the South, and both blazed new trails for women in higher education. In 2019, President Gabel became the first woman to hold the highest office at the University of Minnesota, where she presides over 5 campuses, 67,000 students, and 27,000 faculty and staff. Before becoming president, she was the first female executive vice president for academic affairs and provost at the University of South Carolina, where she was responsible for all of the schools and colleges on the Columbia campus, as well as working closely with all 8 system campuses as well. Prior to that, she served as the first female dean of the University of Missouri's Trulas College of Business, where she was named a rising or shining star by the Wall Street Journal during her tenure there. So you begin to get a consistent theme here. First in everything and the name Joan Gabel go very nicely together. President Gabel has an exceptional record of leadership and scholarship, and she has received numerous awards and honors, including the Bucci, Kemper, and Holmes Cardoza Awards for excellence in research and writing. She's also served as editor-in-chief of the American Business Law Journal. And although she is now a Golden Gopher at the University of Minnesota, to us at the University of Georgia, she will always be a Bulldog. We are proud to call her an alumnus of the UGA School of Law, where she was an outstanding member of the National Moot Court team, while I had the privilege of serving as Moot Court faculty advisor. I am absolutely thrilled to welcome her back to our campus to provide this year's Louise McBee Lecture. Please join me in welcoming President Joan Gabel.
I am so happy to be here. It's hard almost to express how joyful it is for me to be back here and be honored in this way to be able to talk to you about something that I know we all care so deeply about, but particularly this year, particularly at this time, particularly introduced by my friend and former professor. It is an incredibly warm welcome, and I'm very, very grateful to receive it at this really strange time that we all find ourselves in, but perhaps one of the best times for us to talk about higher education and think about the future. In the video where Louise talks about the tumult of the times in which she was a leader and said it was the most challenging up to that moment, I think it might be fair to say we are in the next phase of challenging. And so it's a wonderful time to be here to share some thoughts, but mostly to have the chance to do some Q&A and discussion afterwards. So one of the things I like to do is anchor in quotes from people who are smarter than me. And so I'll start with a quote by F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was actually born in St. Paul, Minnesota. I didn't know that until I moved there. That's where I live now. But he said, "It's a funny thing coming home. Nothing changes. Everything looks the same, feels the same, even smells the same. And you realize what's changed is you." And I feel that when I'm here now, since I don't get to come back as often as I would like to. But when Jerry talks about the ties that are really deep here, I mean, my mother went here, I went here, my husband, my sister, my nephew's a student here now. So this is an incredibly special place. And I had the good fortune of some tremendous professors, but no one compared to Jerry, who really took all of us to the next level. He's had an incalculable impact on me as a person and as a leader. And even after I had the good fortune of switching from the practice of law into higher education, then I got to meet Peter Shedd and be in his gracious hands to help me figure out the best way to be our best self in this wonderful work that we all do. These relationships are the sorts of things that you really can't calculate about our connection to a university, our connection to higher education, what higher education and university life allows us to do, where we can make mistakes and recover, where we can navigate the absence of a skill and build that skill, where we can be encouraged to do so. It's a place, but it's a place that's filled with people who allow you to be and want you to be your best self. And that is a very unique thing that we don't find in many other places, especially now. And it's a place, but a place filled with people who want to steward that best self. And think of it, if I can use language that isn't always ideal in a higher ed conversation, but think of it as a return on investment. The investment that society makes in the institution, the investment students make in their time and in the resources they apply, the investment that the faculty and staff make in creating a climate that allows for curiosity and discovery and that kind of life well lived that we all seek for our students and I think legitimately and fairly for ourselves. And so I speak about this a lot, the way in which we create communities, the power of mentorship, the power of friendship, which has been so meaningful for me, especially with several people in this room. And that this is all really a team sport. We talk about sports a lot in higher education too, I think that's okay. But today we'll talk about in this amazing building that I haven't been in a really long time, what it means to steward students, faculty, staff, a community towards that best life, that life well lived, and share some of my own experiences, some examples from what I've experienced, what's going on at the University of Minnesota, just as a point of comparison. But I do have to say how honored I am to participate in this tradition. The Louise McBee Lecture in Higher Education is a very treasured invite for people like me, and to have my name associated with hers as a student of this institution is incredibly humbling. It's an incredible loss for her to be gone, but she leaves a legacy that we've heard described many times, so I won't repeat what you've heard. But I will say, I think it bears repeating endlessly, that she changed the rules for a lot of people, but especially for women like me. And the fact that I'm here right now talking to you is part of her legacy, and I'm extremely grateful for that. And I wanted to share, since this is the first Louise McBee lecture since her passing, another quote, which might well have been written for her, I think, by Ralph Waldo Emerson. He wrote a poem that, ironically, I had to read and memorize for a leadership class a long time ago. And he said, "To laugh often and much, to win the respect of intelligent people and the affection of children, to appreciate beauty, find the best in others, to leave the world a little better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition, to know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived, this is the meaning of success." She was successful, without question, and it's a privilege to have my name associated with hers, along with the other 30 higher education leaders who've given this talk. And if I'm not mistaken, and forgive me if I am, I think I might be the first alumna to give this talk, so I'm doubly honored by that. But there's actually a pretty rich tradition of Minnesota leaders who've given this talk, so I have to tip my hat there too. President Peter McGrath gave this talk in 1997, Nils Hasselmo in 2006, Bob Brunix in 2011. They're all former University of Minnesota presidents. In 2016, Dr. Earl Thomas gave the talk, but he received his PhD from Minnesota. And in 1999, Judith Eaton, who's the former chancellor of our sister system, Minnesota State, gave the talk. So that's a really nice Minnesota-Georgia connection. And as a transplant in Minnesota, I look for those connections a lot, actually. So we'll talk about Minnesota on and off throughout my remarks as we think about what it means to fulfill higher education, social contract, and value proposition, and think about how through these chaotic times, perhaps there are some pressures that create the diamonds and allow us to think even more clearly about what we can do or should do. So to my surprise, I am 25 years in to my career in higher education. I was a department chair, a dean, a provost, and now president. So I've worked at 5 universities across 4 athletic conferences, and we've seen a lot of change during that period of time, how priorities are set, what students are expected to do, what students expect from us as the faculty and staff. what our parents expect, what the general public expects, lots of change in the landscape, and of course this has been amplified tremendously in the last couple of years, all of which really seems to be calling kind of an existential question around our mission and, in other words, our value proposition. And this is a very interesting time to be doing the work that we're doing, but it's also a challenging time. It's a challenging time to be in leadership. But I think that our path forward is critically important. I think our role in society as a place and also as a group of people is critically important right now. And in order for that to be successful, to fulfill the legacy of people like Louise McBee, and I think everyone in this room and beyond, is to strike a balance between understanding what it is we're supposed to do, our values, the origins of higher education, and then within that context, curate an agile mindset about what we can and should do in the future. And I want to start by talking about the origins and setting the framework and the foundation. And by origins, I mean origins, like the ancients, what the classics say about higher education, about education in general, that really define our founding values and principles and have served us here at the University of Georgia, at the University of Minnesota, and arguably higher education across the world for over 1,000 years. And if we're lucky, will serve for many thousands of years into the future, into time immemorial, in a purposeful way. And I promise I won't talk about Plato the entire time, but if you could indulge me, I do want to give some context, because I think when we are under pressure and when we are challenged, it helps inform our path if we think about our role in society and anchor in that framework in order to meet the moment and think about what the future holds. So I want to anchor that discussion in a social contract framework. And Plato was really the first philosopher documented to discuss social contract theory, but it was from that, it's throughout modern political theory. It's been a continuous point of discussion. I'm going to apologize in advance for anyone who studied philosophy in the room, because I'm going to go over this at a very high level and probably be unqualified to answer any substantive questions. But just to lay a framework, Socrates followed Plato in the Platonic dialogue, Crito, and in that dialogue, says that social contract theory maintains that we explicitly or implicitly surrender some of our freedoms and submit, and those are powerful words, but we do so in exchange for the benefits of social order and an organized society. And that was accepted as an exchange. In contract law, we would say a bargain for exchange. You give something and you get something back, and it's worth it to you to do so. It makes sense for everyone involved. We are all better off for it. And this concept really floated throughout various scholars and works, but took a lot of shape in the 16th and 17th century under analysis by Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. So just a very quick synopsis of these. Hobbes and Locke posited that people are self-interested and rational, but that they need authority and structure in order to create society, and society exists because we are better able to avoid harm if we work together. Rousseau, about 75 years later during the Enlightenment in the 18th century, noted that yes, people are self-interested and rational, but they not only need society, they actually need government to guarantee opportunity and advancement. And then the idea evolves further in the late 20th century with Rawls and Gautier saying that social contract theory presumes that the exchange we make requires us to submit or cede to authority or government, but that it gives us actual opportunity. So we're not just avoiding harm, we're recognizing that we have things we otherwise would not have. So authority in exchange for opportunity, structure in exchange for opportunity, or if we were to put an American lens on this, we cede to society in order to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And as we move forward into the times we find ourselves in, we would say we cede in order to have public health, we cede in order to have public safety, we cede in order to have public works and roads, we cede for things like an infrastructure bill, if we were to use, the last 24 hours as a point of discussion. And in effect, we cede and give things up in order to get things that we want, that we consider superior to what we would be able to do on our own. But consistently in these works, and of course, very clearly, I hope to all of us in the room, education was a presumed or implicit part of this exchange. It was part of what you need by working together. It's part of what you get and benefit from by being a member of an organized society. And the most overt and arguably the most persuasive position on this idea was from Rousseau, who noted that education is required in order to properly understand and engage in the broader society, and that we exchange in order to have that opportunity for advancement, and that opportunity to be educated allows us to fully make a choice about what kind of society we want to live in, and it allows us to be participants in the advancement of that society, and that education is the key to our ability to do that. So we aren't just a place, we are a group of people, and when we work together is how we achieve this higher level. Rousseau described how education prepares individuals to be contributors and how education is part of the bargain, core to the bargain of the social contract, but in a way that assumes and reflects that education is a source of betterment both individually and for society, and that a core contributor to the opportunity is that society is supposed to make us better. And so this has been presumed for literally centuries now, that education creates opportunity, that education makes individuals better, that education makes society better. But we are in a time where that question is being called and where we are being asked to explain, at a minimum, the value that society receives in exchange for offering education, particularly higher education. And there are some interesting ideas taking root that I think are worthy for us to talk about in this context. So how do we know that there are concerns taking root? Well, we'll run through some, sort of depressing examples before we get to the good stuff, but we'll start, of course, with funding cuts to higher education, reduction in the investment that occurred during the 2008 recession, from which our sector really has yet to recover despite some small and collective increases in state appropriations. So, in fact, given the depth and breadth of those cuts, only 18 states have been able to restore to at least 2008 levels, while many states have had no increase in funding since then at all. And higher ed institutions faced another challenge in the last couple of years where about half, 27 actually, of the states in this country imposed a new round of cuts to public colleges and universities during the pandemic. I will say, in fairness, that the University of Minnesota is faring better than most. We were not cut, but the percentage has declined over the last 25 years and rapidly during the last decade. So universities have really been very resourceful and resilient to do some very amazing things during this time to manage through growth and efficiency, but using growth and efficiency as a stressor too on our ability to fulfill our part of the bargain for exchange. There's also some challenge around enrollment. Now, I know this doesn't really apply here, particularly at this institution, and actually it doesn't at the University of Minnesota either, but if we're looking at the larger context, if the projections are correct, higher ed institutions are expected to face what we've been calling the cliff, for those of us in student affairs, by 2026. And why is that? That's because during the recession, around 2008, the birth rate declined. And so those students would now be graduating from high school in 2026, and there are simply fewer of them. So this decline will work its way through the K-12 system. We may be in another one, it remains to be seen, over the next few years. And by the second half of the 2020s, really imminently, we should start feeling it. Maybe not here and maybe not at the University of Minnesota, but in terms of the overall conversation around higher education, that will be a distinct pressure. So just as an example, at a place where you may not expect it, the Pennsylvania state system recently experienced their greatest percentage drop in enrollment in well over 2 decades, 5.4%. Is a lot, and a continuing enrollment decline for the 12th consecutive year, which follows this national decline over the last 9 consecutive years. A couple of other challenges that I want to sort of put on the table for our discussion. So in addition to funding and enrollment, there are a few other just sort of checklist of things that are brought up when people discuss the value proposition in today's context. 43 million consumers carrying $1.7 trillion in student debt. a pretty robust conversation about the shift in credentialing away from degrees and into things like certificates, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but is a very different thing from the commitment to create educated people who can discern the value of a organized society. What the implications are for technology, good and challenging, there are both. Changes in sports, even that, I think, is a critical part of our conversation. It's a very big part of our community. And then ultimately, I think the loudest criticism we hear is that we are dogmatic and unwilling to change, and that we don't understand that we need to, and that we should be ripping this whole thing in half and bringing in people who don't know anything about higher education in order to show us what we actually should be and what it would mean for us to actually do our work. And that's my least favorite, by the way. But friends, there's another quote that I want to share by American novelist James Baldwin. And he said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." And I think that's true. So instead of just gnashing our teeth, I think we need to think about what it means to change, or at a minimum evolve in this context and meet this moment. Because at the end of the day, we are unwilling, and I would submit should not abandon our values or our origins or our purpose, but that we can have an agile mindset about the future and infuse a futureness, a modernity to what we do in ways that make sense. When I first became dean, this is a very different person than the pictures I was showing you before, but when I first became dean at Mizzou, one of my board members was this fellow here, Ed Rapp, who's from Pilot Grove, Missouri, which has a population of under 2,000, where more than half the people's last name is Rapp. It's a wonderful town. And he became the CFO at Caterpillar and would have probably been the CEO had he not been diagnosed with ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. And my first day at my first board meeting as dean, he said to me, "I know there's lots of stuff you need to do, but never forget who you are." And he meant me personally, but what he really meant was the College of Business at the time, that there are lots of new things you can do and lots of innovations you can make, but that if you undermine the core of your contribution, the core of who you are, then you're lost and you're spinning, and the contributions can eat up the actual value and the value proposition. And I hear him a lot when we're thinking about the different things that we have in front of us that we could lean into or choose from in improving our campus climate and offering new programs, and in having an agile mindset about the future. But I think we can couple and coexist thoughts about the future with this concept of our values and origins, and really be the next thing that we need to be, the best version of ourselves, just as we hope for our students. So the way we've operationalized this at the University of Minnesota and sort of brought it down to day-to-day decision-making was by stock-taking first, and then working on a strategic plan. So when we were taking stock, we asked ourselves some pretty basic questions, and really didn't intend to answer them. It was really more in the formulation of the question itself, where we asked things like, what is our mission? Who do we serve? And what do we or should we create? And sort of lathered, rinsed, and repeat through those questions over and over again as we were thinking about how we would steward ourselves into our next chapter. So we asked things like the expectation that every student who graduates has a job that many people would expect from us, and employability obviously being a wonderful thing to create, but is that our core mission, or is that an outcome? And working through different things along those lines to try to identify and be able to articulate what our value is, what our origins are, what it is that we would hold as sacred, and then figure out where the room was for the future. At the University of Minnesota, there's a quote carved into, that's Northrop, which is sort of the, iconic campus building that everyone would take their graduation pictures in front of. And the quote says, founded in the faith, it says men, but I'm gonna say everyone, is ennobled by understanding, dedicated to the advancement of learning and the search for truth, devoted to the instruction of youth and the welfare of the state. And that's been there for almost the duration of the University of Minnesota. And I should mention that was founded in 1851, way after the University of Georgia. I'm just gonna say that. But collectively, and to a person, we found that when we thought about that quote and asked ourselves those questions, that it really wasn't that mysterious what we were supposed to do, that some of the challenge really lied more in how we did it than in questioning whether Ed Rapp was right and we should remember who we are, or that Plato and Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau were right in saying that we make a critically important contribution to society, both for individuals and for that society, and that we need to think about that commitment in order to develop the right appetite for what is coming in the future. So we channeled this into the strategic plan, and we chose the word commitments very carefully because commitment implied an intersection between values and action. They weren't just pillars, they weren't just sectors, there's an action to making a commitment, but a commitment is not just a thing you do, it's a way you feel, it's an identity. And so we wanted that intersection. The word choice was really thoughtful and purposeful. And the nature of the commitments are really not rocket science, with full respect to the rocket scientists. So we looked at these 5 commitments. I'll come to the third one, which won't make sense to you probably until I explain it, but they were the things that guided our choices. They were the way in which we answered the questions about mission and who we serve and what we create. And they have guided all of our decisions over these last couple of years. We used them to think about how we did recruiting during the pandemic, for example, and welcomed our largest, most diverse, most first-gen, and actually most Minnesotan freshman class in decades. They guided us as we thought about scholarships even during these financially challenging times. We launched a $50,000 promise. There's no Hope Scholarship in the state of Minnesota, and so commitments to guarantee the cost of education are provocative conversation there. And so this past year, we guaranteed $50,000 AGI earning families tuition. And then this year, just a couple of weeks ago, during Native American Heritage Month, expanded that program for citizens of the 11 tribes in Minnesota, where they have guaranteed tuition at $75,000 up to $125,000, and did that in partnership with the chairs of those tribes. It also has helped us think about the unique contribution that the University of Minnesota makes. One of the things that I think is really challenging around thinking about the future of higher education or our purpose or our value proposition is that we live in this very strange set of attributes in higher ed that don't really exist in other sectors or industries or professions, where we peer review and gauge our value against each other and yet have to find our own distinction at the same time. That doesn't really exist in my observation anyplace else. And it yields in strategic planning often strategic plans where if you put your hand over the logo, they would look exactly the same. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we are all in higher education. We all care about students. We all care about research. We all care about inclusion. And we all care about stewarding our resources, maybe differently in public than in private, but I don't know anybody who doesn't care. And so the fact that we would all talk about those things is not so surprising. But we really wanted to think about, as I know you have also here, what it is that's specific about the University of Minnesota. And so that's really, I'll go back, the third commitment that you see there, intersections. So in the state of Minnesota, it is charming to take the letters MN, which is our postal abbreviation, and insert it anywhere you can. And I thought, I was charmed, I will admit, very charmed when I saw this, and I thought, well, I want one too. So I put it into the third commitment, which is Mintersections, and this reflects how the University of Minnesota, which is the only research institution in the state of Minnesota, is charged and able to fulfill its proposition by looking at what the state of Minnesota uniquely poses as challenges or questions or opportunities, and finding where the strengths align, intersect in ways that advance society and in the individuals who would contribute to that society. So, for example, from that focus and from that lens, we were able to announce Next Gen Med last year, which is a collaboration between Minnesota, Google, and the Mayo Clinic, which is in Minnesota, and which they don't like to say, but was founded by University of Minnesota physicians. And so it's a close partner and a competitor. in that way that we sometimes coexist. And this is a great program where undergraduate health sciences students can leverage the most innovative technology in the delivery of their content, have applied experiences at the Mayo Clinic, and graduate faster, therefore costing them less money and allowing them to enter the workforce faster. It is intended as an intersection of our values to serve students who want to be in the areas where the state needs them most in the ways that allow them to be through in the lowest financial, with the lowest financial constraints, and take advantage of the technology that we've all found we have this amazing appetite for that we didn't realize until a couple of years ago, at least across the board. We take a lot of heat for Next Gen Med because it allows students to earn the degree faster. And there's an argument that by changing the framework in this way, we're undermining what it means to be an educated person by certain constituencies. I actually think it's a legitimate criticism, and it's something that we need to really think about if we're going to do things like this, if we're going to launch programs like this. But our commitment is to think about how to ensure that people are properly educated and have context, have general education in addition to skills in order to be able to be employable, which is very nice, but also to be able to be contributors to society, which is our ultimate value proposition. And I think that there are opportunities for that, where we can remember who we are and still think about our role and our side of the bargain for exchange in the social contract. There are some other places where we've seen this kind of example and this kind of pressure yielding some interesting innovations. So, for example, we recently developed the Masonic Institute for the Developing Brain, which is focused on the first 1,000 days of life and adolescence for neurological disorders in children and adolescents. And this is being led by Damien Fair, who was one of our 2 MacArthur Genius Grant winners. He's an amazing human being. But I find this super interesting myself because my mother, who studied speech pathology here at the University of Georgia, did so because my brother is severely autistic and wanted to be able to offer to families the ability to speak for their child that he never had, still doesn't have. And so the idea of how we think about bettering ourselves as individuals and being contributors to some of the most challenging social questions and doing that continuously over and over again and in structured ways is how we can be fulfilling our value proposition. Another area of intersections for Minnesota is in agriculture, and I know that's a shared space for us too. Minnesota is the land grant institution. It's a huge agricultural economy, the 6th largest in the country, and it's the headquarters of a lot of companies you've heard of, like Land Lakes, and also those who, several of the other farming co-ops, and also some of the companies that benefit from the food that comes out of the ground and then brings it to us, like General Mills is headquartered there, and others. And so we have a lot of work going on there. And then the third area is in sustainability, the third intersection. Picked because Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes. You've seen it maybe on the license plate in the winter as Minnesotans drive through Georgia on their way to Florida. And there are actually 13,000 lakes, I'm told, in Minnesota. But fresh water is an enormous part of the economy and uniqueness of the state. Minnesota actually holds the westernmost Atlantic port. And if you're picturing a map in your head, that might be surprising, but there's continuous waterway from Quebec all the way into Duluth, Minnesota, where Lake Superior is. And so there's these, who knew, kind of attributes about who the university is and where it is, but in ways that impact society as a whole. That if fresh water works, then we are all better off, and that is something that we are uniquely able to do. So we think this is how we at the University of Minnesota, as part of the bigger conversation around higher education, but also part of the state of Minnesota, are able to fulfill our commitment under the value proposition. It plays to our strengths. Minnesota is a longstanding, extremely active research university, one of the originals. Last year and the year before, we exceeded $1 billion in R&D expenditures. It's a big patent producing place. It is the first university like this that I've had the privilege of working with. It is a ecosystem that is really amazing and has a lot of yield. And I'm really proud to see how this is occurring here too, with things like the Innovation Hub, just established a few months ago in the middle of all of this craziness, to have something like that emerge and just be a 5-minute walk away from where we find ourselves right now. I think it's this way that we remember who we are while also being agile and thinking about the future that allows us to make the unique contribution that only higher education can make. And then there are the other commitments in the strategic plan too that I know are shared. So for example, we have a deep commitment around inclusion and creating a community and a culture where belonging is strong and individuality and ideas and perspectives is treated with dignity. But what does that mean in this applied way? Where's the agility that we need to find in that? And so one of the things we're working on, and this is actually in process, just as an example, is something we're calling the Twin Cities Futures Fellows. So we're doing this in the wake of some tragedy that had national effect but occurred in Minnesota and is felt in a unique way there with George Floyd and Dante Wright and others. But we also have some unique attributes that allow us to perhaps make things better in the simple way we would describe that. So for example, there are 17 Fortune 500 companies in Minnesota, and they are all committed to equity and inclusion. How do we work together so that we don't have initiative fatigue and in fact create momentum and economy of scale and actual community change? So the university is working with St. Thomas University, which is a private school around the corner, really, and the headquartered companies to develop a fellowship program post-grad, sort of like post-bac that students might do before they go to medical school, but in the business world, where these students would, in a cohort, rotate from company to company and learn about what it means to be in a headquartered economy, but also work with our community organizations and engagement to think about what it means to be a member of a society that's trying to get better, not because we want to burden them with making it better, but because we want to listen to affected communities and make it better ourselves with their help, and think about what that means for the future of the community that we want to be. So this program is being developed now and comes directly out of the strategic planning process. So when you work through all this and you ask yourself, what does all of this mean? We want to respect our values and get better. I mean, who wouldn't say that kind of thing? What does it mean to think in this modern way and quote Plato at the same time? I think it means that we have to be thoughtful and intentional and purposeful about our mission, that they can't just be etched into marble or quotes in the beautiful historic buildings like the ones we're in right now. I think we have to ask ourselves questions about what they mean to us today, and we have to ask ourselves where that creates an appetite for change into the future. For us, it's meant programs like Next Gen Med or the Twin Cities Futures Fellow. It's meant a lot of partnership, a lot of listening, a lot of collaboration, probably more than we've ever done, honestly, as an institution or as the people who make up that institution. And it requires some vulnerability and humbleness if you're going to take the necessary steps that James Baldwin challenged us to do. But it also requires some bravery and courage to take Ed Rapp's advice too, and remember who you are and not just get swept into a current and pulled in directions that are not how we have the best possibility of meeting the moment, but are just reacting. And so in the spirit of Rawls and Rousseau, and to engage as part of a commitment from society to its members and its members back to society, I think we must be purposeful about trying to strike this balance. And so I think at the end then we think about places like this place and these people, the kind of people who create the opportunity that we are so deeply beneficiaries of, and we tell that story and we think about what it means in ways that we can proudly advocate for, so that that work can continue and can continue to create opportunities for individuals, but also for the society that we're committed to serve. So with that, I'll say thank you again very much for having me, and it's been a tremendous honor, and I look forward to your questions.